Hey everyone, Anarch here. So this is another installment in the series Anarch Abridged. And the topic of today's video is really more or less just why we should not focus only on one narrow aspect of social or political or economic transformation. And the reason I say it in that kind of broad way, usually I kind of got a quippy title, and I'm sure you'll find a quippy title here in the YouTube title, is just that the topic is pretty complicated, but I think I've got a framework by which we can have a coherent discussion about it. So in the script to the video that I'm writing right now, the next big video essay, A Modern Anarchism Part 3, it's all about revolution and how transformation takes place. And I posit that there are four fields of action, okay? Four fields that are transformed, which determine how power structures function, and that's hierarchical structures or horizontal structures. So those are individual conditioning, and that involves all kinds of things. That involves ideology, that involves a person's beliefs and expectations. It entails their ability and disabilities, their mental disorders, their traumas, their beliefs about incentives or disincentives, their fears, their hopes, all that stuff. All those things only that are just contained within the individual, okay? The next one is interpersonality or interpersonal relations. And those are those relations that you have with, people in your immediate world, the people that you actually just like directly apprehend. Giving some examples, this would be like friends, family, co-workers, even to some degree, like the people that are like in your city or, in your town that you see, from time to time. People who work at the store you go to, those people that you immediately see and speak with and hear and interact with in your daily life, those people and those connections. So this entails a lot of different kinds of things that are present in that sphere. This is where, for example, racism or various forms of bigotry play out, as opposed to what I'll get to here in a minute, which is to say white supremacy. What I'm saying here with racism is just, that interpersonal bigotry, the judgment and low expectations of other people, the mistreatment of other people, that also including those forms of interpersonal violence. That escalates all the way up to things like lynchings, for example, and its severity. But it also contains all kinds of other structures, the family, friendships, but all of these things, these relations that play out within your personal world. That's, I think one of the most important ones is relationships, your romantic and sexual relationships. Those form a very important part of your interpersonality and, determine a lot about how you will affect others within your world. You'll notice that, both of these spheres are very important. And so are the last two spheres. The third is social structure. So social structure are those agglomerations of, social fixtures that are above and beyond just the actions of individuals and their interpersonal world. So let me give an example of, say, like white supremacy, but maybe a more easy example would be like law, okay? Law or, capitalist property relations, the relation between the owner and the laborer, right? Or patriarchy, the structure which favors men over women in a social sense. You'll notice that, patriarchy and white supremacy and law, those aren't embodied down at the interpersonal level. Those are embodied up at a social the level of social agglomeration, right? Those things that are enforced upon entire societies. So social structures, they actually begin to function kind of like structures. That's why they have the name structure in their name. And they become almost kind of mechanistic in a sense. They are influenced by interpersonality and ideology, but they kind of have been embodied outside of the wills of a bunch of individuals. They are now kind of part of a reinforcing process on the rest of society. So there are lots of examples of social structures. I mean, you also have, for example, religious social structures. Historically, you've had example of things like the clergy being an ascendant ruling class. There are all kinds of social structures we could talk about. Obviously, I'm sure by this point you're starting to realize these are all, seems like there's some pretty big feedback here. These things seem to be in relation to one another, and that's what we'll be getting at here in a moment. But the last one in this list, this last field of relations, I have called environmental relations. And the reason I say I have called it this is that, those previous things, those previous names that I just used, those are common phraseology to use to refer to those concepts. But here what I'm really trying to do is I'm not trying to use this word material structure, because what I'd really like to emphasize is that, individual conditioning and interpersonal relations and social structures are still part of the material world, right? They don't exist in some realm outside of the material world. So when I say environmental structures, what I'd like to emphasize is that really I'm just talking about environment in a broad sense, that which is outside of the conscious being and the agglomeration of things by conscious beings, right? And even up to the level of societies, which, as we've said, have become pretty embodied to the degree they almost function like structures. But environmental structure is 99.9999999% of the universe, right? Everything in the universe that isn't conscious beings and the doings of conscious beings can be considered environmental structures. That includes the ecology, forests, fields, non-human animals, maybe not all of them, depending on how you define consciousness. But also it would include things like the means of production, factories, roadways, infrastructure, the internet, actual currency, computers, firearms, vehicles. Like, it's a lot of stuff, right? And it's a lot of important stuff. So here's the thing. Those are kind of the four fields. And the reason I lay them out is because I think that it's really important that we sort of have that foundation before we continue. So I'm fine with the fact, we've spent like 8 minutes of video now laying this all out, because this is going to be really important in our conversation. So this video is really meant to address the fact that there is a tendency among all kinds of different radical left perspectives to focus too narrowly on one or two of these and to then sort of neglect the other ones. So all kinds of examples could be given. I'm just going to kind of choose some specific examples, and hopefully they'll kind of illustrate what we're getting at here. I'm sort of like simultaneously referring to something like how there are anarchists that think that you should only focus on changing people's ideology and getting rid of phantasmal figments of their ideas and of ideology, and changing the way we relate to one another interpersonally, changing our relationships to other people, and that will be constitutive of a transformative process. That if we scale that and scale that and scale that, we get a transformative process. And I'll address, some more details on this. We'll kind of elaborate on that here in a moment. But the other side of this coin is this sort of like economic reductionist or class reductionist perspective. A sort of, often you'll find it in Marxism, or maybe some varieties of like more like historical anarchism, which is the idea that, say, the means of production, the development of the means of production determine the social structure that lies on top of that economic system, right? So you know, this idea that depending upon what the economic development of some culture looks like as they proceed through a series of stages will determine what kind of society sits on top of it. And you might get some kind of like base superstructure model like in Marxism. But these two, you'll notice they kind of focus on two of those four fields, and they sort of eschew the other one, right? So in this sort of like more individualist or egoist anarchist perspective, what you'll find is that there's more of this over-focus on individual conditioning and interpersonality. And in this more economically reductionist or sort of maybe Marxist class framework, you get a really significant focus on social structure and environmental structure. So the thesis of this video, and which will be argued in much more depth and detail in this video essay that is still being created, is that you cannot just over-focus on any of these and leave the other ones out. The entire process from beginning to end, you must fight on all four fields, okay? And I want to be very clear when I say you must simultaneously fight on all four fields. Because if you don't, if you eschew any of them, they will act to reinforce one another. If you, for example, only focus on ideology and interpersonal relations, the social structure of society and the way the infrastructure is formed and the way the supply chains are built and the expectations, the social expectations, the structure of law and the way that violence is enforced as per those norms is going to recondition the things that you have changed within the interpersonal and individual sphere. Not to say that you may not make some very significant transformations in that process, but the structures, those bigger structures, are going to recondition those things over time. And it's not going to take the structure much effort to do it either, because the structure is constantly reseeding these ideological perspectives and these interpersonal relations back into society over and over and over, iteratively, every time that, you know, as we proceed through the world, but especially as we, like, say, have children, as we proceed through the generations. But alternatively, if all you try to do is change social structures and environmental structures, you end up carrying through all of these hierarchical, ideological perspectives into the new world. And so, for example, you see this in like vanguardism, where they still have all of these same hierarchical mentalities, and they have not fixed their own issues with, say, you know, white supremacy, or the role of the state, or the role of women in society, the necessity of you know, revolutionary feminism, for example, or the importance of the ecology, even incomplete in that environmental sphere. But what ends up happening then is that they end up reorganizing society and those social and environmental structures to match the hierarchical mentalities, which they have not themselves gotten rid of, right? And so then you have this grand revolution, perhaps, and you do a coup and you overthrow everything and you transform all these different, you know, aspects of society, and you get rid of the old state. But the new thing you put in place is just is a hierarchical society as well. It reproduces all of these old interpersonal relations, all these old ideological relations. And so in time, those interpersonal and ideological relations, which have not been sufficiently altered, themselves come to recondition social structures and environmental structures. Okay, so there is no way out of this situation. You absolutely must fight on all four fronts. There was actually a really wonderful video just done by Zoe Baker that I think really emphasizes this topic in the context of the Spanish Civil War. So it's interesting. Zoe Baker's video is about the cultural components of the Spanish anarchists. So, you may think that it's maybe more arguing for an individualist or interpersonal focus, but it should be said, our focus on the Spanish Civil War is by default one that was generally based around analysis of social structure and environmental structure. So what this is really doing, what her video is really doing then, is adding in the understanding that it was also the alteration of interpersonal structure. It was also the alteration of people's ideologies in a cultural sense that really helped transform Spain before the anarchist revolution. So what we see is in our most successful examples, in all of our most successful examples of actually carrying out a transformative revolutionary process, all 4 of the fields are being fought on. And insofar as that there's an incomplete transformation on one of these 4 fields, that is the very process which holds us back in a broader term sense. So they end up being stuck trying to fix that incomplete process that took place during the time of rupture, which ends up being a real impediment in the process. And in every example where there was that incompleteness, they were stuck with that impediment of one kind or another. So here's something I really want to emphasize as well. It's very important that this principle not only be practiced in a broad social sense. And let me explain what I mean by that. It's not good enough to have this group over here focusing on ideology and interpersonality, and this group over here is focusing on social structure and environmental structure, or maybe it's even split up more than that, which it might very well be. You might have this group over here is just focusing on environmental stuff, and this group is only focusing on social structure, and this is only ideology, and that's only interpersonality. That actually we are currently in that condition to a very large degree, and it hurts us when we're in that condition. Let me be clear about what I mean by that. So ideology, just transformation of ideology alone. Pamphleting, writing and disseminating theory, something kind of partially what I'm doing on this channel is very much acting on that field of the transformation of individual conditioning. I'm trying to help you transform your ideology to understand the world differently so that you will then act differently in the world. But there's no real interpersonality or social structure or environmental structure being done here. And that's just by way of my own limitation. I can't do that, right? Okay, but let's give another example. Some people focus a lot on the interpersonal aspect. And this is where you'll get a lot of what might sometimes be called lifestyleism. People who are like, oh, my polyamory is radical, or my queerness itself is transformative, or, when I just help out my friends and family, that is transformative. Those are good things. They're right. So those things can be radical in their natural thrust, and those things can act as transformative vectors in society, but by themselves, they do not contain that ideological conditioning. They do not contain the transformation of social structure. They do not contain the transformation of environmental structure. And then social structure. Well, that's kind of a reformist project, right? All they're trying to do is change the content of social structures. Say we're trying to fight back against white supremacy, but we're not fighting back against how white supremacy is encoded into environmental structures, how it is embodied in redlining, and how it is embodied in the way cities are literally structured, and how infrastructure is built out, and how all of these, material incentives are distributed in society. So we can fight back against this social structure of white supremacy to some degree, but in the same way as those previous 2 fields, it's going to be incomplete because there's going to be these restoring factors in the other fields. Or say, as an example of only focusing on the environmental field. Well, we've had decades now of just environmentalist movements. And these environmentalist movements focus very narrowly on environmental structures, right? I'll get to another example in a moment, but changing the way we interact with the ecology, trying to restore natural habitats, you know, trying to, for example, in the latter part of the last century, fighting back against nuclear energy, or trying to promote the usage of sustainable technologies and so on. You know, this would be a very narrow focus there on those environmental structures. Or another example of narrow focus on environmental structures may be the sort of progressivist developmental conception of a lot of Marxists, where they're like, oh, you just have to build the means of production. The means of production just got to get more and more and more developed, right? Technology just has to get more and more developed. But they're not focusing on the transformation of social structure. They're not focusing on the transformation of ideology and on interpersonality. So we actually have a lot of examples where people have over-focused not just on like two, but like on one of these fields. And in every example we've got really incomplete transformations that tend to get recuperated in one way or another. Right? And all these examples I'm giving, you know, there's like really perverse incentives that will tend to recuperate each of these. You know, let's go all the way back to the first one. You know, in ideology, just transformation of ideology, you know, on YouTube, I'm here to tell you there's a lot of perverse incentives. You know, like there's a lot of things that the platform is pressuring you to do, which are going to slowly recuperate your work, which is going to water it down and is going to make it less radical, less revolutionary in the process. Well, that's happening in all these fields. The more narrowly you focus, the more you will be able to be recuperated. That's the broad trend that's taking place in this mistake. The more narrowly you focus, the more able to be recuperated your tactic will be. So, well, what's the solution, Daniel? Seems like you're just kind of crapping on everyone here. The solution is that we build organizations that are simultaneously trying to do all four of these. We build organizations that are educating people to change their ideology, that are trying to establish new interpersonal relationships within the organizations, that are trying to build new social structures. The organization itself is a social structure, and that are also trying to reclaim place, right? They're trying to reclaim territory. They're trying to build out new environmental structures. And I mean that in an extremely literal sense, you know, having land, having buildings, right? Having things, having stuff that the organization owns, okay? As soon as that happens, what you will find is that organization will hold together much more strongly. If that organization is doing work transforming the ideology of itself and things outside of itself, it is doing due diligence to try to transform interpersonal relationships between the people that are within it, it is building out robust new organizational structures that create and fight back against hierarchical mentalities and create horizontal mentalities instead. And they are trying to find place. They are trying to make themselves embedded in the world and understand the importance of being embedded in the world. Those are going to be way more successful organizations, in my opinion. And I think that we can see that in all of these most successful revolutionary projects, you know, in the CNTFAI, as I started with, but also in things like the Zapatistas or Rojava or Ukraine. In all of these, you can see that there was a very broad spanning project where all of these aspects were involved. And so what I'm really trying to emphasize here then is that we need to not have just pluralism of approaches, okay? And this is not, you know, like kind of there's this old saying like diversity of tactics. Yeah, diversity of tactics, okay? But in a more general sense, perhaps I'll do a video on diversity of tactics at some point. But the bodies that we build must within themselves practice transformation on all four of those fields. I hope that makes sense. I think that's a really important concept that I want to emphasize here. We're trying to build these bodies that themselves, as they perpetuate this new form of society. And what we know is that, you know, in order for a power structure to be embodied and to perpetuate itself, it has to act in all four of these fields. It has to act to transform all four of these fields. So that means that what we build must also be acting to transform all four of these fields within itself, so that as it expands, as it what's the word I'm looking for? Subsumes more of the world into these horizontal relations, it holds together. And as it copies itself, as it iterates itself, as people copy it, they are creating these self-consistent horizontal structures that actually act to undermine hierarchical power, and which are very hard for hierarchical power to actually recuperate. Because I think that's one of the things we really need to keep in mind here. Okay, is this force of recuperation is so much more powerful than any of the early revolutionaries thought it was. You know, everybody thought, oh, the contradictions are going to build up inevitably, and the whole system will collapse on itself because, you know, it just can't help but collapse on itself. That is false. You have to build something that is powerful enough to threaten the system. It's not just going to blow up on its own, and if it does, there's no reason to believe that it'll become something liberatory in the process. We have to make it become something liberatory. We have to consciously and intentionally build a new world. We have to build structures which will embody that new world. So, you know, I hope this wasn't too polemic. I wasn't really trying to like argue with anybody here. I was really trying to kind of point out a different way of looking at these problems and hopefully a mode of analysis that will be helpful for you as you look back at history. And if you are an organizer or you're thinking about becoming an organizer, hopefully you can take this toolkit that I've just given you, that I'm putting in your hands right now, and which I will develop far further in the upcoming video essay, part 3 of A Modern Anarchism. I want this to be a toolkit for you. This is actually, what I'm saying here is actually useful enough that you can use this to analyze your organizations. If you you go and you look at your organization, you're like, wow, our organization only does, you know, this one thing. It only acts on this one field, or these 2 fields, or maybe even the 3 fields, and you've left out a 4th somehow. Ask yourself how you can move into structuring the 4th into your organization. And if there are a bunch of groups that are all, say, doing one aspect or 2 aspects of this, ask how you can combine all your efforts together such that you join together as this unified structure. I'm not saying you have to like smash your orgs together, but like somehow create a means by which you are coordinating a solidaric, you know, federated structure such that you are now fighting on all 4 of those fields in a cohesive way, such that none of you are going to be at risk of being recuperated by your incomplete approach. That's what I wanted to say, and I think I pretty well elaborated on all that. Hopefully I've avoided most of the polemic pitfalls here and just conveyed my opinion. Yeah, I don't know that I have a whole lot more to say about it. I think this is one of the rare videos I've ended, you know, at least a little bit before my 30-minute mark. So if you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe to the channel, and you know, give me your thoughts down below in the comments. You know, if you agree or you disagree, if you're part of an organization, if you've got experiences, perhaps, you know, when you think back and you really think to the things I'm saying, and you're like, oh my God, I can think of examples when my organization did XYZ, or this situation I heard about in history. You know, give us some insight down there in the comments. I think this video has like real potential to, you know, have a focus on organization, real revolutionary action. And the last thing, if you enjoy the work that I'm doing on this channel, go over to my Patreon at patreon.com/anarch, and please become a patron. This is a really important time in my career as a creator and as a theorist, insofar as that I'm just right on this cusp of being able to do this work full time, where it would just make a really big difference in my life. I would be able to stop doing part-time jobs and just focus on this work. And that would make a huge difference to me. And I assure you it would make a huge difference to the channel. So if this work interests you, if you think I'm doing important work, please go become a patron at whatever amount that you can spare. And I think that's it for today. That's the spiel. It was good talking with y'all, and I'll see you next time.